The shadow at the door, the whispered command, the eye that never closed. Every night, as my husband's hands claimed my body without tenderness, without love, I knew she was there. Through the crack in the bedroom door, Virginia Blackwood's eye gleamed in the darkness like a predator watching its prey. Her voice, cold as winter frost, would drift through the silence. "Harder, son. She needs to learn her place." For 2 years, I lived under the tyranny of two souls, a man who called his violence love, and a woman who wanted me erased from existence. But tonight, as I sit here in my quilting room in Oak Ridge, Kentucky, watching my granddaughter Emma learn to sew her first stitches, I know that every scar was worth this moment of peace. My name is Eleanor May Thompson, though folks around here know me as Miss Ellie the Quilter. These weathered hands have stitched thousands of quilts, each one telling a story of survival, of hope reclaimed from the ashes of despair. The sun streams through my porch window, illuminating threads of every color. Just like the threads of my life, dark and light, woven together into something beautiful. But my story doesn't begin with quilts and grandchildren. It begins with terror, with a young girl who thought marriage would be her salvation, only to discover she had leaped from one hell into another. Oak Ridge, Kentucky, 1961. I was 14, all knees and elbows, with dark hair that never stayed pinned the way Mama wanted. Our house sat on the edge of town like an afterthought, weathered wood and patched roof, testament to Daddy's struggles with the bottle and the coal mines. The sound of his boots on the porch steps could mean anything: a paycheck that might last the week, or another night of Mama's tears and bruises explained away as clumsiness. I learned early to read the weight of those footsteps, the particular rhythm that meant danger was coming through our door. "Eleanor May, you get yourself in here and help with supper?" Mama called, her voice carefully bright, despite the purple shadow blooming around her left eye. Martha Thompson had been beautiful once I'd seen the wedding photo hidden in her bureau drawer. But life with Clarence had worn her down to bone and resignation. That particular evening, as I peeled potatoes with hands that shook slightly — they always shook when Daddy was in one of his moods — I made myself a promise. Someday I would marry a good man, a gentle man, someone who would treat me like something precious instead of something owned. How could I have known that promise would lead me straight into Virginia Blackwood's web? The Blackwood name carried weight in Oak Ridge. Their lumber mill employed half the men in town, and their Georgian mansion on the hill overlooked our struggles with the detached interest of royalty-watching peasants. Virginia Blackwood was our unofficial queen widow of the mill's founder mother to its current owner, an arbiter of who belonged in polite society. Richard Blackwood was 22 when I first noticed him at church. Tall and lean, with dark hair slicked back with pomade, and a smile that could charm honey from a hive. When he tipped his hat to me after Sunday service, my 16-year-old heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice cultured in a way that spoke of education beyond Oak Ridge's one-room schoolhouse. "Lovely weather we're having." I managed a stuttered, "Yes, sir," before fleeing to Mama's side, my cheeks burning with embarrassment and something else, something that felt like hope. For weeks, he appeared at my periphery. A casual greeting at the general store, a nod across the church pews. Each encounter was brief proper, but his attention felt like sunlight after years of shadow. The first time he asked to walk me home from church, Mama's eyes widened with something between terror and possibility. The Blackwoods didn't associate with families like ours. Coal miners' daughters didn't catch the eye of mill owners' sons. Yet here was Richard offering his arm with all the gallantry of a knight in the romantic novels I borrowed from the church library. "Your family has deep roots in Oak Ridge," he said as we strolled through the town square, passing the monument to soldiers who'd never come home from foreign wars. "There's something to be said for authentic Kentucky stock." I glowed under his attention, too young and desperate to notice How he spoke of me like livestock being evaluated for breeding. Too naive to see that his mother watched our courtship from her mansion windows, her pale face a mask of calculation and disgust. 3 months later, when Richard asked Daddy for my hand in marriage, I thought I was the luckiest girl in Kentucky. Even Daddy sobered up enough to put on his one good suit for the proposal dinner, though he still reeked of whiskey and disappointment. My son has always been particular about his choices. Virginia said that evening, her words carefully measured as she surveyed our humble table. She wore black silk despite her husband having been dead for 5 years, and her pale hands remained folded throughout the meal, never once lifting the cornbread Mama had baked special. I trust Eleanor understands the responsibilities that come with the Blackwood name. I nodded eagerly, having no idea what those responsibilities would cost me. Our wedding was the social event of 1963 in Oak Ridge. Virginia spared no expense, though she made it clear the extravagance was for the Blackwood reputation, not for my happiness. The dress she selected was beautiful, but cold, all white satin and pearl buttons that felt like tiny shackles being fastened around my throat. "Remember, child," she whispered as she adjusted my veil in the church vestibule, her breath smelling of mint and malice. "You are no longer Eleanor Thompson. You are Mrs. Richard Blackwood. Act accordingly." The ceremony passed in a blur of incense and organ music. Richard's kiss was perfunctory, his smile bright for the crowd of Oak Ridge society filling the pews. My family huddled in the front rows like sparrows among peacocks, their borrowed finery no match for the silk and fur surrounding them. But it was during the reception at the Oak Ridge Country Club that I caught my first glimpse of the real Virginia Blackwood. As Richard and I swayed to our first dance, she appeared at the edge of the dance floor, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Lovely couple," said Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, joining Virginia with a glass of champagne. "Though one does wonder about the disparity." Virginia's smile was razor thin. "Richard has always been charitable. It's one of his finer qualities." Charitable. The word hit me like a slap, but Richard's arms tightened around me, and I told myself I was being silly. Virginia was just protective of her son. She would warm to me in time. How could I have known that warmth was not in Virginia Blackwood's nature? That beneath her cultured exterior lived something cold and calculating, something that saw love as weakness and wives as interlopers to be eliminated. The Blackwood mansion became my prison on my wedding night. Richard carried me across the threshold with appropriate ceremony, but once the door closed behind us, his mask began to slip. The gentle courtship had been performance. Now came the reality of possession. This is your home now, Eleanor," Virginia said, appearing in the foyer like a black-clad specter. "I trust you'll find everything educational." My new bedroom was beautiful and sterile, all mahogany furniture and Persian rugs that muffled footsteps. The walls were covered in portraits of dead Blackwoods, their painted eyes following me as I tried to find comfort in luxury that felt more like a cage. That first night, as Richard claimed his marital rights with the mechanical efficiency of a man performing a duty, I heard her. Virginia, standing just outside our door, her voice barely audible through the wood. "Yes, Richard. Show her who commands this house." I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to disappear into the mattress, but there was no escape from the reality settling around me like quicksand. This wasn't the fairy tale I'd imagined. This was something else entirely. "A Blackwood woman doesn't slouch, child." Virginia's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. I straightened my spine at the breakfast table, my hands trembling as I reached for the silver sugar bowl. "And we certainly don't grab at things. Grace is something that can be learned even by those not born to it." 3 weeks into my marriage, Virginia's education had become a daily torture. Every gesture was critiqued, every word corrected. I couldn't eat, speak, or breathe without her disapproval raining down like acid. "Yes, ma'am," I whispered, adding sugar to my coffee with exaggerated care. Richard sat across from me reading his paper with the detached interest of a man watching strangers on a train. He'd stopped defending me after the first week when Virginia had taken him aside for one of their whispered conferences that always ended with him looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. "Louder, Eleanor. A lady doesn't mumble." Virginia's pale fingers drummed against the mahogany table. "How do you expect to represent this family in society if you can't manage basic conversation?" I cleared my throat and repeated myself, hating the way my voice cracked with nervousness. Around us, the dining room felt enormous and oppressive, its oil paintings of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors bearing witness to my daily humiliation. "Better." Virginia conceded, though her tone suggested I'd barely met the minimum standard. "Now about your appearance. That dress is entirely too tight across the bodice. Are you trying to attract unwanted attention?" Heat flooded my cheeks. The dress had been a wedding gift from Richard, selected by Virginia herself. But somehow, on my body, it became inappropriate. "I could alter it," I offered quietly. "Indeed you could. In fact, you will. Today, Ruby will show you to the sewing room after breakfast." Virginia's smile was winter cold. A proper wife should know how to maintain her wardrobe, among other things. Richard finally looked up from his paper, catching something in his mother's tone. "Mother, perhaps what, son? Perhaps I shouldn't teach your wife the skills she'll need to be a credit to our family." Virginia's eyebrows arched with dangerous delicacy. "Would you prefer she embarrass us at the harvest ball next month?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He never said anything when it mattered. The paper returned to its position between us, a barrier more impenetrable than brick. After breakfast, Ruby led me to the sewing room, a bright space at the back of the house, where Virginia's sewing machine sat like a mechanical judge. Ruby was Virginia's personal maid, a thin woman in her 40s, whose expression never changed, as if years in the Blackwood household had carved away her capacity for emotion. "Mrs. says you're to take in all your day dresses," Ruby announced, her voice flat as cemetery stones. "Says they're cut too provocative for a married woman." I wanted to protest, to point out that Virginia had chosen every piece of clothing in my wardrobe. But Ruby's expression warned against argument. In this house, Virginia's word was law, and questioning it brought consequences I was only beginning to understand. As I worked with shaking fingers to alter dress after dress, taking in fabric, until the bodices were loose enough to satisfy Virginia's modesty standards, I felt my identity being systematically erased. The girl who had married Richard Blackwood was disappearing stitch by painful stitch, replaced by something smaller, quieter, more acceptable to Virginia's vision of what a Blackwood wife should be. The real torment began when Richard started drinking. It began subtly, a bourbon after dinner, a flask tucked into his coat pocket when he left for the mill. But within a month, the subtle became obvious. He'd return home late, stumbling slightly, his eyes glazed with alcohol and something else. Something that made him look at me like I was responsible for every disappointment in his life. The first time he hit me, I was so shocked I didn't immediately feel the pain. We'd been married 6 weeks, and I'd made the mistake of asking why he'd been working so late when the mill closed at 5. "Don't question me," he slurred, swaying slightly in our bedroom doorway. "You think, because you married up, you can interrogate me like some common fishwife? Richard, I was just—" The slap came so fast, I didn't see it coming. One moment, I was standing by the vanity, the next, I was on the floor, my cheek burning and my ears ringing. Through the open door, I could see a shadow in the hallway. Virginia watching. "That's right, son," came her voice, soft but audible. "Some lessons require emphasis." Richard's face crumpled with something that might have been remorse, but Virginia's approval was stronger than his conscience. He stumbled toward the bed without helping me up, without apologizing, without acknowledging that he'd just shattered something fundamental between us. I lay there on the cold floor, touching my swelling cheek, and realized that my real education as a Blackwood wife had only just begun. The nights were the worst. In darkness, Richard's inhibitions disappeared, entirely replaced by a mechanical brutality that treated my body like property to be used rather than a person to be loved. But it wasn't just his hands that violated me. It was her presence, always there, always watching. Virginia had developed the habit of checking on us. "For your own good," she'd say when caught lingering outside our door. A mother worries about her son's happiness. But I knew better. She wasn't there out of maternal concern. She was there to witness my degradation, to ensure that every night drove home the lesson of my worthlessness. Through the crack in the door, her eye would gleam in the hallway's dim light, pale blue, unblinking and human in its intensity. Sometimes I wondered if she ever slept, or if she spent her nights patrolling the house like a guard, ensuring no prisoner escaped. "Please, Richard," I whispered one November night as his weight pinned me to the mattress. "Not tonight. I'm not feeling well." His breath was sour with bourbon and rage. "Not feeling well or not feeling obliging? My mother warned me about women like you. All sweetness until they get what they want, then nothing but excuses and headaches." "That's not—" "Shut up!" His hand covered my mouth, pressing so hard I could barely breathe. "You'll do your duty, or you'll find out what happens to wives who forget their place." Through the door, crack Virginia's voice drifted like poison gas. "A good wife never refuses her husband, Eleanor. Remember that." I closed my eyes and tried to disappear into the mattress to find some safe place in my mind where Richard's violence and Virginia's voyeurism couldn't reach. But there was no escape from the reality that I'd traded one nightmare for another, and this one came with society's blessing and God's supposed approval. The next morning brought fresh humiliations. Virginia would greet me at breakfast with knowing smiles and pointed comments about the importance of wifely submission. She'd taken to inviting her friends for afternoon tea, where I was expected to serve and remain silent while they discussed me as if I weren't there. "The girl's looking peaked," observed Mrs. Whitmore, the postmaster's wife, as I poured her Earl Grey with hands that barely shook anymore. Practice had steadied them, though it couldn't steady my heart. "Marriage doesn't seem to agree with her. Some adjustments take time," Virginia replied with false sympathy. "She comes from such simple people. Learning to be a proper wife requires patience and discipline." Of course," Mrs. Henderson added, accepting her teacup with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Though one does wonder if the breeding is there. Thoroughbreds and draft horses, you know." The ladies laughed softly at this comparison, their sound like glass, breaking in slow motion. I kept my face blank, my movements precise, giving them no reaction to feed upon. But inside, something was dying, the last remnants of the girl who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings. By Christmas of 1963, I'd lost 15 pounds and most of my hair's shine. The mirror showed a hollow-eyed stranger wearing my face, someone who flinched at sudden sounds and spoke only when spoken to. Virginia's training was working. I was becoming the ghost she wanted me to be. But ghosts, I was learning, could sometimes surprise their creators. January 1964 brought the worst winter Oak Ridge had seen in a decade. Snow piled against the mansion's windows like nature itself was trying to bury us, and the wind howled through the valley with voices that sounded like the damned. It was during this frozen hell that I discovered I was pregnant. The realization came with morning sickness so violent I could barely keep water down. For 3 days, I hid my condition, terrified of how Virginia would react to the news. A baby would complicate her hold over Richard, would create a bond between us that she couldn't control or corrupt. When I finally found the courage to tell Richard, his reaction was worse than I'd feared. "Pregnant." He looked at me like I'd confessed to a crime. "How could you let this happen?" I don't understand. I thought you'd be happy." My voice sounded small, even to my own ears. "A baby Richard, our child." But Richard's face had already hardened into the mask he wore when Virginia was displeased. "Mother won't like this. Not now. Not when we're just getting you properly trained. As if summoned by our conversation, Virginia appeared in the parlor doorway. Her pale eyes took in Richard's expression, my defensive posture, and arrived at the truth with frightening speed. "I see," she said, her voice arctic. "How convenient. Mother, I can explain." "Explain what, Richard? That your wife has entrapped you further. That she's ensured her position in this house by the oldest trick known to scheming women?" Virginia's smile was sharper than broken glass. "Oh, my dear boy, you have so much to learn about the feminine mind." "It's not like that," I protested, finding courage I didn't know I possessed. "I love Richard. I want to give him children." Virginia's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. "Love child, you're barely capable of managing yourself, much less a baby. What makes you think you can successfully carry a Blackwood heir?" The word heir hung in the air like a challenge. Because that's what this was, a battle for the future of the Blackwood name with my unborn child as the prize. "Perhaps," Virginia continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when planning something particularly cruel, "we should discuss arrangements. There are facilities, discretionary facilities, where young women in your situation can find solutions." The implication hit me like a physical blow. She wanted me to end the pregnancy, to kill the only thing that had given me hope since my wedding day. "No." The word came out stronger than I'd intended, surprising all three of us. I won't kill my baby for your convenience." Virginia's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something so cold and poisonous it made my blood freeze. "We'll see about that, won't we?" What followed was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to break my will and eliminate the threat my pregnancy posed to Virginia's control. She restricted my food, claiming I was eating too much and would get fat. She insisted on accompanying me to my doctor's appointments, where she'd whisper concerns about my mental stability and family history of difficulties. "The girls' people are known for their instability," she'd tell Dr. Morrison while I sat there like a specimen being examined. "Her father drinks, you know, and her mother. Well, there are questions about her capacity for motherhood." Dr. Morrison, a contemporary of Virginia's who delivered half of Oak Ridge's prominent families, nodded gravely at these fabrications. "We'll monitor the situation closely, Mrs. Blackwood. If there are any concerns about the child's prospects, we can discuss options." Options. Always options, as if my baby were a problem to be solved rather than a life to be protected. Richard grew more distant as my pregnancy progressed. Virginia had convinced him that a child would interfere with his responsibilities at the mill, would tie him down when he should be expanding the family business. Worse, she'd planted seeds of doubt about the baby's paternity. "Are you certain it's yours, son?" I heard her ask one evening when they thought I was asleep. The girl was so eager to marry. One wonders what she might have been doing before the wedding. "Mother, that's not. Eleanor isn't like that." "Isn't she a coal miner's daughter who set her cap for the wealthiest young man in town, who practically threw herself at you every Sunday after church?" Such ambition rarely comes without experience. By my 6th month, Richard looked at me with open suspicion. The gentle touches that had marked our courtship were replaced by cold examination, as if he were trying to detect evidence of betrayal in my changing body. The end came on a February night when the wind was howling like banshees around the mansion. Richard had been drinking heavily at the mill's annual board meeting, and Virginia had spent the evening filling his head with poison about unfaithful wives and uncertain paternity. I was in our bedroom trying to rest despite the baby's increasingly active movements when Richard stumbled through the door. His eyes were bloodshot, his face twisted with a rage I'd never seen before. "Whore," he slurred, swaying in the doorway. "My mother was right about you. You're nothing but a scheming little whore." "Richard, please, think about the baby." "My baby! My baby!" His voice rose to a roar. "How do I know it's mine? How do I know you weren't spreading your legs for half the men in Oak Ridge before you trapped me?" The accusation was so ludicrous, so cruel, that I couldn't even respond. I'd been a virgin on our wedding night, painfully, obviously so. But Virginia's poison had taken root, and logic had no power against cultivated hatred. Richard lunged at me with a violence that made his previous attacks seem gentle. His hands found my throat, then my shoulders, shaking me so hard my teeth rattled. When I tried to protect my belly, he grabbed my wrists and slammed me against the bedroom wall. Richard stopped the baby, but he was beyond hearing, beyond reason. Virginia's voice drifted from the hallway, encouraging rather than restraining. "Show her, son. Show her what happens to lying wives." The final blow came when I fell. Richard's hand caught me across the face with such force that I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the Persian rug. I hit the floor hard, my stomach taking the full impact. The pain was immediate and devastating. Something vital tore inside me, and I felt warmth spreading between my legs, not the warm glow of new life, but the terrible heat of life draining away. "Ah, help me," I whispered, reaching toward Richard with bloodied fingers. "Please, something's wrong." But Richard had already stepped back, his face pale with the realization of what he'd done. Through the doorway, Virginia watched with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "Clean yourself up," she said coolly. "We'll call Dr. Morrison in the morning. Tell him you fell down the stairs. Clumsy city girls aren't used to proper staircases." I lost my daughter that night. 7 months of hope, of planning, of imagining a future where I might finally have someone to love who would love me back, all gone because Virginia Blackwood couldn't tolerate sharing her son's attention. Dr. Morrison confirmed the miscarriage with professional sympathy and no questions. The death certificate listed the cause as accidental trauma resulting from a domestic fall. Another lie added to the mountain of deceptions that kept the Blackwood reputation pristine. For 3 weeks, I lay in bed recovering from surgery and drowning in grief so deep it felt like drowning in black water. No one came to comfort me. Richard avoided our bedroom entirely, sleeping in his childhood room down the hall. Virginia appeared only to deliver meals and reminders of my failure. "Perhaps this is for the best," she said one morning, setting a tray of untouched food on the bedside table. "You're clearly not equipped for motherhood. Better to learn that lesson now than after producing a defective heir." Defective? As if my baby had been a product that failed quality inspection rather than a human life snuffed out by cruelty. But lying there in that cold bedroom, surrounded by portraits of dead Blackwoods, who seemed to mock my grief, something crystallized inside me. Not hope was too fragile for what I was feeling. This was harder, more durable. This was determination. Virginia Blackwood had taken my child. She would not take my life. Spring came late to Oak Ridge in 1964, as if winter itself was reluctant to release its grip on our frozen valley. I was still recovering from my loss, moving through the mansion like a ghost, haunting rooms that had never been home when Margaret Williams moved in next door. I first saw her through the bedroom window, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pinned back, practically wearing a traveling suit that spoke of independence rather than widowhood. She supervised the moving men with quiet authority, her gestures economical and precise. There was something about her bearing that caught my attention, a self-possession I'd never seen in any woman I knew. The new neighbor, Virginia, observed coldly, joining me at the window with the silent step she'd perfected for her surveillance. "A widow from Louisville. Claims she's here to care for an ailing sister, but I suspect she's simply another old woman seeking importance in a small town." Virginia's dismissal should have warned me away, but something about Margaret Williams drew me like light draws a moth. Perhaps it was the way she moved without seeking permission, or the way she looked directly at people when she spoke. In a world where I'd learned to make myself invisible, her visibility was revolutionary. Our first meeting happened by accident. I was tending Virginia's prized rose garden, one of the few outdoor activities I was permitted, when a ball rolled under the hedge, separating our properties. A child's voice called from the other side, "Grammy, my ball's stuck." Before I could react, Margaret appeared at the fence line. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll ask the neighbor to help." She looked at me with kind eyes that held no judgment, no calculation. "I'm so sorry to bother you. My granddaughter is visiting, and she's managed to lose her ball in your beautiful roses." "Oh, that's perfectly fine." I stammered, unused to polite requests rather than commands. I retrieved the ball, a simple red rubber sphere that seemed to glow with childhood innocence. "Here you are." "Thank you so much." Margaret's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that made something tight in my chest loosen slightly. "I'm Margaret Williams, by the way. I've just moved in next door." "Eleanor Blackwood." The name felt strange on my tongue, still foreign after months of marriage. What a lovely garden you have. These roses are spectacular." Margaret's appreciation seemed genuine, not the calculated flattery I'd grown accustomed to from Virginia's friends. "Do you do all the work yourself?" Pride flickered in my chest, a feeling so unfamiliar I almost didn't recognize it. "Yes, ma'am. I learned from my mother back in Oak Ridge. She always said dirt under your nails meant you were building something beautiful." Margaret laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. Would you perhaps like to join me for tea sometime? I find I'm rattling around in that big house all by myself." The invitation was so unexpected, so normal, that I almost accepted before remembering my circumstances. I should ask my mother-in-law. She manages our social calendar." Something flickered in Margaret's expression, understanding perhaps, or recognition. "Of course. But if you ever find yourself free for a neighborly chat, I'm usually in my garden around 3 o'clock. Gardens are wonderful places for conversation." After she left, I stood among the roses, feeling something I'd almost forgotten, existed the possibility of friendship. But Virginia's shadow fell across the garden before I could fully embrace the feeling. "I trust you weren't making arrangements without consulting me," she said, her voice cutting through the spring air like frost. "The Williams woman may seem respectable, but appearances can be deceiving. Widows living alone often develop unconventional ideas about a woman's proper place." "We only talked about roses," I replied carefully. "I'm sure." Virginia's smile was thinner than paper. "Nevertheless, I think it best if you limit your interactions with our new neighbor. We wouldn't want her getting the wrong impression about your availability for social calls." But Margaret Williams had planted something in me that Virginia couldn't easily uproot. Over the following weeks, I found excuses to work in the garden during Margaret's afternoon routine. We'd exchange pleasantries across the fence, conversations about weather and flowers that gradually deepened into something more meaningful. Margaret never pried, never pushed. But she listened with an attention that made me feel heard for the first time in months. When I mentioned missing my mother's cooking, she shared recipes. When I admired her reading glasses, she talked about the books that had shaped her thinking. Slowly, carefully, she was showing me that there were other ways to exist in the world. The breakthrough came on a June afternoon when Virginia was attending one of her charity meetings in town. I'd been working in the garden when a summer storm rolled in with startling speed. Margaret appeared at the fence just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Eleanor, come inside before you're soaked through." I hesitated, knowing Virginia's rules about entering other people's homes without permission. But the rain was turning serious, and something in Margaret's expression, concern rather than calculation, made me trust her. Her house was everything Virginia's wasn't: warm, lived-in, welcoming. Books lined the walls and photographs of family covered every surface. A half-finished needlepoint project lay on the sofa, and the scent of baking bread filled the air. "Sit down, dear. Let me get you some tea." Margaret bustled about her kitchen with comfortable efficiency, while I perched nervously on the edge of a chintz armchair. "I was just thinking how lonely it gets rattling around in these big houses all by ourselves." "I'm not alone," I said automatically. "I have Richard and Mrs. Blackwood." Margaret paused in her tea preparation, studying my face with those perceptive eyes. "Of course you do." I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that sometimes, even in a house full of people, one can feel isolated, The word hit me like a physical blow because it was so accurate. Isolated. That's exactly what I was, cut off from my family, my past, my own sense of self. "Eleanor," Margaret said gently, setting a cup of tea before me. "Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but you seem tired. Are you quite well?" It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine concern, that it broke something inside me. The tears came without warning, months of suppressed grief and fear pouring out in ugly, wrenching sobs. Margaret didn't try to stop me or offer empty platitudes. She simply moved to the sofa beside me, offering the silent comfort of presence, while I fell apart in her living room. When the storm finally passed, both the one outside and the one in my heart, I found myself telling her everything. The miscarriage, Richard's drinking, Virginia's cruelty. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, as if silence had been a dam that finally burst. Margaret listened without judgment, her hand warm on mine, her face reflecting the horror and compassion I'd never seen from anyone else. "My dear child," she said when I finally ran out of words, "what you're describing isn't marriage, it's imprisonment, and it's not your fault." No one had ever said that to me before. Not my fault. The words were revolutionary. "But the pastor says," "The pastor is wrong." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who'd lived long enough to distinguish truth from convention. "God doesn't want his daughters to live in fear and pain. What Richard and his mother are doing to you, it's not love, Eleanor. It's abuse." Abuse. Another word that named my reality in a way that made it impossible to deny. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no skills. I'm trapped." Margaret squeezed my hand. "You're not trapped, dear. You're just convinced you are. There's a difference." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I have a cousin in Cincinnati, Howard Williams. He runs a small dressmaking shop, and he's always looking for reliable help. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and it comes with a small room above the shop." Hope flickered in my chest, dangerous, terrifying hope. I couldn't. Richard would never let me leave. "Richard can't legally prevent you from leaving if that's what you choose to do. You're his wife, not his property, despite what he and his mother may have led you to believe." Margaret's voice grew firm. "But you'd need to be careful. Men like Richard don't take kindly to losing control." That night, as Richard pawed at me with bourbon-soaked hands, while Virginia's shadow lingered in the hallway, I held onto Margaret's words like a lifeline. Not trapped, just convinced I was. Over the following weeks, Margaret and I began to plan in secret. She wrote to her cousin Howard, describing me as a young woman seeking honest work and a fresh start. She taught me basic sewing skills during our stolen afternoon visits, my clumsy fingers gradually learning to guide fabric through her machine. "Every woman should have a skill that's hers alone," she said, watching me hem a simple skirt. "Something that can put food on her table and a roof over her head without depending on anyone else's goodwill." The lessons were more than practical. They were revolutionary. Margaret was teaching me that I could exist independently, that my worth wasn't tied to my usefulness to Richard and Virginia. But Virginia's surveillance was intensifying. She'd begun asking pointed questions about my whereabouts, about the neighbors I might be talking to. Ruby reported my movements with the dedication of a paid informant. "I don't like that Williams woman," Virginia announced one evening at dinner, her pale eyes fixed on me with uncomfortable intensity. "There's something unsavory about a widow living alone. It sends the wrong message to impressionable young wives." Richard, already halfway through his second bourbon, nodded absently. "If you think Eleanor shouldn't associate with her mother, I'm sure she understands." They were discussing me as if I weren't there, a habit that had become increasingly common as Virginia's control tightened. But this time, instead of shrinking into myself, I found a fragment of courage. "Mrs. Williams has been very kind to me," I said quietly. I enjoy talking with her about gardening. Virginia's eyebrows arched with dangerous delicacy. Kindness can be deceptive, my dear. Some people befriend lonely wives for their own purposes. I'd hate to see you taken advantage of by someone seeking to cause trouble in this family. The implication was clear-end the friendship or face consequences. But for the first time since my wedding day, I wasn't entirely alone. Margaret's strength was becoming mine, her courage slowly replacing my fear. I understand your concern, I replied, meeting Virginia's gaze with steady eyes. But I believe I'm a good judge of character. It was a small rebellion, barely noticeable to anyone else. But Virginia saw it immediately, her expression shifting from patronizing patience to something much colder. "We'll see about that," she murmured, and I knew that my time was running out. July brought oppressive heat to Oak Ridge, the kind that made thinking difficult and tempers short. The mansion's thick walls provided some relief, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating for reasons that had nothing to do with weather. Virginia had declared war on my friendship with Margaret, and her campaign was both subtle and devastating. It began with restrictions. I was no longer allowed to work in the garden. Unsupervised, Ruby was assigned to watch me, ostensibly to help, but actually to ensure I had no opportunity for fence-line conversations. My movements through the house were monitored more closely, with Virginia appearing at unexpected moments to check on my activities. I thought I heard voices from the garden, she'd say, appearing in the kitchen doorway while I washed dishes under Ruby's watchful eye. "Were you perhaps talking to someone?" "Just humming, ma'am." I'd reply, my hands steady in the soapy water despite my racing heart. "Sometimes I sing while I work." Virginia's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "How rustic. Do try to remember that we have neighbors. Not everyone appreciates impromptu concerts." But the isolation was wearing on me. Without Margaret's friendship, the mansion felt more like a tomb than ever. Richard's drinking had worsened through the summer, his violence becoming more frequent and unpredictable. Some mornings I woke with bruises. I couldn't remember receiving my body a map of cruelties inflicted in alcoholic hazes. The breaking point came on an August evening, when the heat had everyone's nerves stretched thin. Richard stumbled home from the mill 3 hours late, reeking of whiskey and failure. The lumber business was struggling. Other mills had modernized while the Blackwoods clung to old methods, and Richard's incompetence was becoming impossible to hide. "Where's my dinner?" he demanded, swaying in the dining room doorway. "A man works all day. Least he can expect is a hot meal waiting." "It's in the warming oven," I replied carefully, rising from my chair where I'd been attempting to read one of Virginia's approved books. "I'll have Ruby serve it immediately. Ruby's gone home, and my mother's at her church meeting. Just you and me tonight, wife." Richard's smile was ugly predatory. "About time we had some privacy." Dread pooled in my stomach like ice water. Richard was always worse when Virginia wasn't there to witness his cruelties. Without an audience for his performance of dominance, his violence became more personal, more vicious. I served his dinner with hands that barely trembled. Months of practice had taught me to hide my fear. But as Richard ate, spilling gravy on his shirt and drinking directly from the bourbon bottle, I could feel violence building in the air, like pressure before a storm. "You've been different lately," he said suddenly, his bloodshot eyes focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. "Quieter. More secretive." "I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me." His fork clattered against his plate. "Ruby says you've been asking questions. About buses. About train schedules to Cincinnati." My blood turned to ice. I had been making inquiries carefully, discreetly, but apparently not carefully enough. Ruby's loyalty was to Virginia, not to me. "I was just curious," I said weakly. "I've never traveled much." Richard's laugh was devoid of humor. "Curious, that's what you call it. I call it something else entirely." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I think it's time you remembered exactly where you belong." What followed was worse than his usual violence. Without Virginia's presence to constrain him to mere brutality, Richard unleashed something darker. He dragged me upstairs by my hair, threw me onto our bed, and proceeded to demonstrate his ownership in ways that left me broken and bleeding. "Ugh, you're mine," he panted against my ear as his weight pinned me down. "Property, possession. You'll never leave this house because you have nowhere to go and no one who wants you." When he finally passed out, snoring heavily beside my violated body, I lay in the darkness, planning murder. Not his, though the thought had occurred to me, but my own. The window in our bedroom faced a 3-story drop onto the flagstones of Virginia's prized patio. It would be quick final and would spare me from facing another day in this nightmare. I was actually standing at the window, my hand on the latch, when I heard it. Margaret's voice drifting across the dark garden from her open window. She was reading aloud poetry, I thought, though I couldn't make out the words. But the sound of her voice, warm and alive and free, reminded me that there was another world beyond these walls. A world where women could live without fear, where kindness existed, where I might someday remember what it felt like to be human. I stepped back from the window and began planning escape instead of death. The next morning brought Virginia's return, and with it an escalation I hadn't anticipated. She took one look at my battered face and smiled with satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "I see Richard had a conversation with you about appropriate behavior," she observed over breakfast. "I trust it was illuminating." Richard avoided my eyes, his hangover making him pale and shaky. In daylight, faced with the evidence of what he'd done, shame warred with his mother's approval. But Virginia's influence was stronger than his conscience. "The girl needed reminding of her place?" He mumbled into his coffee. "Can't have wives getting ideas above their station." "Indeed not." Virginia's pale eyes fixed on me with cold satisfaction. "Ideas can be so dangerous in the wrong sort of mind." But I was no longer the same terrified girl who'd married into this family. Margaret's friendship had planted seeds of self-worth that even Richard's violence couldn't destroy. As Virginia congratulated her son on his brutality, I was mentally reviewing the escape plan we'd developed during our secret meetings. Howard Williams had agreed to hire me sight unseen based on Margaret's recommendation. The bus to Cincinnati left Oak Ridge every Tuesday and Friday at 6:15 a.m. from the depot downtown. I had $37 saved from household money I'd managed to pilfer over the months, not much but enough for a ticket and a few days' food. The challenge was getting out of the house without triggering Virginia's suspicion. She'd assigned Ruby to watch me more closely than ever, and Richard's guilt was making him clingy and unpredictable. "I thought we might spend more time together," he said that evening, his attempt at tenderness grotesque after the previous night's violence. "Maybe take walks in the garden like we used to during our courtship." I wanted to scream that we'd never taken romantic walks anywhere, that our entire relationship had been built on deception and desperation. Instead, I nodded and tried to look grateful for his attention. But Virginia was watching our interaction with calculating eyes. "How lovely," she said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "A renewed devotion to marital harmony. Though I do hope Eleanor understands that her first loyalty must always be to this family's reputation." The warning was clear: behave or face consequences that would make Richard's violence seem gentle. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Richard's snores and Virginia's periodic footsteps in the hallway she'd taken to checking on us hourly, I made my final decision. Margaret was right. I wasn't trapped, just convinced I was. Tomorrow was Friday. The bus left at 6:15 a.m. I was going to be on it. The plan was simple: rise at 5 a.m., dress, quietly slip out through the kitchen door, and walk the mile to the bus depot before anyone discovered my absence. By the time Richard and Virginia woke, I'd be halfway to Cincinnati and freedom. What I hadn't counted on was Virginia's insomnia. I'd learned to move silently through the mansion's creaking halls, but as I crept toward the kitchen with my small suitcase, a floorboard betrayed me. The sound wasn't loud, but in the pre-dawn quiet, it might as well have been a gunshot. "Going somewhere, dear?" Virginia's voice came from the shadows at the end of the hallway. She stood there in her black silk robe, pale as a wraith in the dim light filtering through the windows. But it wasn't her ghostly appearance that stopped my heart. It was what she held in her right hand. A carving knife from the kitchen, its blade catching the light like liquid silver. I couldn't sleep, I stammered, setting down my suitcase with trembling hands. I thought I'd make some tea. With a suitcase? Virginia's smile was winter cold as she stepped closer. How thoughtful. Planning to serve tea for the entire county. There was no point in pretending anymore. She knew. Had probably known for days, watching me with those pale, calculating eyes while I thought I was being clever. Yes, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I'm leaving. I don't think so. Virginia continued her approach, the knife held casually but purposefully. You see, Eleanor Blackwood wives don't simply leave. It sets such a poor precedent. You can't keep me here forever. Can't I? Virginia's laugh was like glass breaking. You seem to forget that you're a disturbed young woman with a history of instability. Recently lost a child due to her own carelessness. Been acting strangely, talking to strange neighbors, filling her head with inappropriate ideas. The implications hit me like physical blows. She could have me committed. In 1964, a husband's word combined with a doctor's cooperation could lock a woman away indefinitely. And Virginia had connections, influence, the power to rewrite reality to suit her needs. Richard wouldn't let you, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were false hope. Richard will do what's necessary to protect this family's reputation. He's always been such a dutiful son. Virginia was close enough now that I could smell her perfume, expensive French scent that couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of something rotten. Besides, he's grown quite tired of your difficulties. A period of rest in a proper facility might be exactly what you need. The kitchen door was behind me, freedom just steps away. But Virginia stood between me and escape, and the knife in her hand made her intentions crystal clear. Now then, she continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when instructing servants. You're going to return to your room, unpack that ridiculous suitcase, and forget this foolish notion of leaving. In the morning, we'll call Dr. Morrison to discuss your episode. I looked at this woman who'd made my life hell for over a year, who'd encouraged her son's violence, who'd caused the death of my unborn child. And something inside me, something that had been beaten down but never quite broken, finally ignited. No? Virginia's eyebrows arched with dangerous surprise. I beg your pardon. I said no. I straightened my spine, finding strength I hadn't known I possessed. I'm leaving this house, Virginia, tonight, and you can't stop me. Can I? The knife came up, its point aimed at my throat. I think you underestimate my dedication to protecting this family. But as Virginia raised the weapon, the kitchen door burst open behind me. Margaret Williams stood in the doorway, still in her nightgown, but fully alert. In her hands, she held a heavy cast-iron skillet. Step away from her, Mrs. Blackwood. Margaret commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Right now. Virginia's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known her. This is private family business, Mrs. Williams. I suggest you leave immediately. Private threatening a young woman with a knife seems fairly public to me. Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her eyes never leaving Virginia's weapon. Eleanor, come, stand behind me. I wanted to move, but Virginia's knife held me frozen. She'll kill you too, I whispered. I don't think so. Margaret's voice was steady, confident. Mrs. Blackwood is many things, but she's not stupid. Murdering neighbors tends to attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. Virginia's face contorted with rage, but Margaret was right. Whatever else she was, Virginia was too intelligent to commit obvious murder. Her cruelties were always carefully planned, legally defensible. You're making a terrible mistake, Virginia hissed, but she lowered the knife slightly. Interfering in family matters has consequences. So does threatening people with kitchen cutlery. Margaret moved closer, her skillet raised and ready. Now Eleanor is going to pick up her suitcase and walk out that door. You're going to let her go. She's my son's wife. She belongs to this family. She belongs to herself. Margaret's voice carried the ring of absolute conviction. Eleanor, go, now! I grabbed my suitcase and bolted for the door, expecting at any moment to feel Virginia's knife between my shoulder blades. But she was too focused on Margaret, too shocked by the older woman's interference to react quickly. As I reached the threshold, I heard Virginia's final threat. This isn't over. I'll find you, girl. No matter where you run, I'll find you. But Margaret's response followed me into the darkness. You'll have to go through me first. Outside, the August night was humid and alive with cricket song. My hands shook as I fumbled with the gate latch, expecting Virginia or Richard to burst from the house at any moment. But the mansion remained silent, its windows dark, except for the kitchen where Margaret stood guard. The walk to the bus depot felt like sleepwalking through a dream. Every shadow could hide pursuit, every sound could herald capture. But as the sun rose over Oak Ridge's hills and the Cincinnati bus wheezed to life, I realized I'd done it. I was free. The bus pulled away from the depot at exactly 6:15 a.m., carrying me toward an uncertain future that had to be better than the certain hell I was leaving behind. Through the window, I watched the mansion on the hill grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the worst chapter of my life. I never saw Virginia Blackwood again, but sometimes, even now, I dream about that knife in her hand and wonder what would have happened if Margaret hadn't been watching from her window that night. The bus to Cincinnati was half empty, filled with working folks heading to jobs in the big city and students returning to college after summer break. I chose a seat near the back, my small suitcase clutched in my lap like armor, and tried to make myself invisible. Every time the bus stopped, my heart hammered against my ribs. Would Richard appear at the door demanding my return? Would Virginia have called ahead, turned me into a runaway wife that local authorities would help capture? But the stops came and went without incident, and gradually I began to believe that escape was actually possible. The woman sitting across the aisle was about 40, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. She noticed my nervous glances toward the front of the bus and leaned forward with maternal concern. First time traveling alone, honey. I nodded, not trusting my voice. So, Cincinnati's a good town for starting over, she said quietly. Plenty of work for folks willing to earn their keep. You got people there? Yes. A cousin of a friend. It wasn't quite a lie. Howard Williams was Margaret's cousin, and Margaret had become more than a friend, she'd become my salvation. The woman smiled. Good. A girl your age shouldn't be wandering strange cities alone. Too much trouble out there for those who don't know the ways. As the miles rolled past, I allowed myself to imagine what freedom might look like. A small room of my own where I could lock the door and know that no one would enter without permission. Work that was mine, that I could take pride in. Maybe someday, friends who liked me for myself, rather than tolerating me for my husband's name. Cincinnati appeared on the horizon like a promise made of brick and steel. Smokestacks reached toward the sky, and the Ohio River curved around the city like a protective arm. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen, more intimidating than I'd expected, but also full of possibilities that Oak Ridge had never offered. The Greyhound station was chaos, people rushing in every direction, announcements echoing from speakers, the smell of diesel fuel and fried food creating an assault on senses accustomed to quiet, rural life. I stood in the middle of it all, clutching my suitcase and the piece of paper with Howard Williams' address, feeling like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. You look lost, miss. The voice belonged to a Negro woman about my mother's age, her uniform marking her as a station employee. Her expression was kind, but cautious. She'd probably seen plenty of young women arrive in Cincinnati with nowhere to go and no plan for survival. I'm looking for... I consulted my precious piece of paper. Northside Neighborhood, Williams Dressmaking. Her face brightened. Oh, you're going to see Mr. Howard. That's good, he's decent people. Take the number 17 bus, get off at Freeman Avenue. The shop's right there on the corner, can't miss it. 20 minutes later, I stood before a narrow storefront wedged between a barber shop and a grocery. The painted sign read, Williams Dressmaking, quality work at fair prices. Through the window, I could see women bent over sewing machines, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of skilled labor. The bell above the door announced my arrival with a cheerful jingle. A small man with thinning hair and spectacles looked up from a cutting table covered with fabric. "You must be Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth I remembered from Margaret's letters. "I'm Howard Williams. Welcome to Cincinnati." Howard's wife Gladys emerged from the back room wiping her hands on an apron. She was a sturdy woman with graying hair and the no-nonsense manner of someone accustomed to running a business. "So you're Margaret's protégé," she said, looking me up and down with professional assessment. "She says you're eager to learn the trade." "Yes, ma'am. I'll work hard, I promise. We'll see about that. Hard work's different from wanting to work hard." But Gladys's smile took the sting out of her words. "Come on, let me show you where you'll be staying." The room above the shop was tiny, just large enough for a single bed, a wardrobe, and a small table by the window. But it was clean and private, with a lock on the door that I tested twice to make sure it worked. After months of living under Virginia's surveillance, privacy felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. Breakfast at 6, work starts at 7. Gladys explained, setting fresh linens on the bed. "You'll start with simple tasks, sorting buttons, cutting patterns, cleaning up scraps. As you learn, you can work up to more complex jobs. Pay is $8 a week, plus room and board. $8 a week. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Earned by my own hands, free from Richard's control or Virginia's approval." That first night alone in my little room, I sat by the window watching the street below. People walked with purpose, talking and laughing, living lives that belonged to them. For the first time in over a year, I fell asleep without fear. The work was harder than I'd expected, but more satisfying than anything I'd done since leaving home. My hands, soft from months of enforced idleness, quickly developed calluses from handling scissors and fabric. My back ached from bending over cutting tables, and my eyes burned from focusing on tiny stitches. But every blister and cramp was proof that I was building something, a skill, a future, an identity beyond Mrs. Richard Blackwood. The other seamstresses were curious about the new girl, but respectful of privacy. In a trade that attracted women fleeing various forms of trouble, they understood that some stories were better left untold, except for Betty Simmons. Betty was the shop's unofficial mother hen, a woman in her 40s with iron gray hair and a tongue that could strip paint. She'd been widowed young, raised 2 children alone, and had no patience for self-pity or delicate sensibilities. "You got that look," she announced on my 3rd day, watching me fumble with a particularly stubborn seam. "Like a dog that's been kicked too many times. What happened to you, girl?" "I'd rather not talk about it." "I bet you wouldn't, but keeping poison bottled up just makes it stronger." Betty's hands never stopped moving as she spoke, her needle flying through fabric with mechanical precision. "I seen plenty of women come through here running from something. The ones that heal are the ones that learn to talk about it." I wanted to tell her to mind her own business, but there was something about Betty's matter-of-fact kindness that made honesty feel safe. "I was married," I said quietly, "to someone who wasn't good to me. Most men aren't, honey. Some are just worse than others." Betty's voice was gentle despite her harsh words. "You get out before it killed you. Barely. Good for you. Takes more courage to leave than to stay, no matter what the preachers say about wifely duty." Betty tied off her thread and looked directly at me. "Now, the real work begins." "What do you mean?" "Learning to live instead of just survive. Learning that you're worth more than what some man decides to give you." Betty's smile was fierce. Learning to be Eleanor instead of somebody's wife. Over the following weeks, Betty became my guide to independence. She taught me to budget my small salary, showed me where to shop for necessities, introduced me to the library where I could borrow books without judgment. Most importantly, she helped me understand that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. Some women need a man to feel complete, she said one evening as we worked late on a rush order. Others just think they do because nobody ever told them different. You strike me as the second kind. The healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong, capable, proud of my growing skills and independence. Other days, panic would sweep over me without warning. Richard was coming to drag me back. Virginia was watching from shadows. I was making a terrible mistake by thinking I could survive alone. But Cincinnati was patient with my recovery. The city absorbed me into its rhythm of work and rest its community of strivers and survivors. Gradually, I began to believe that I might actually build a life here. 3 months after my arrival, Howard approached me with an opportunity that would change everything. "There's a young man who's been asking about you," he said, carefully watching my face for signs of panic. My blood went cold. "Richard?" No, nothing like that." Howard's voice was reassuring. "A local fellow, James Miller. He delivers fabrics for his father's supply company. Good family, good reputation. He's been asking if you might be interested in company." "I'm not ready for... I can't..." The words tumbled out in a panic. "Easy, Eleanor. Nobody's pushing anything." I told him you're focused on learning the trade right now. But he asked if he could bring you some books sometime. Said he noticed you reading during lunch breaks. Books. Not flowers or jewelry or the calculated gifts that marked courtship. Just books offered without obligation or expectation. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd ask you. Your choice entirely." That evening, I stood at my little window watching the street below and trying to imagine trusting a man again. The idea seemed impossible, ridiculous. But then I remembered Margaret's words. I wasn't trapped, just convinced I was. Maybe healing meant learning to distinguish between Richard's false courtship and genuine kindness. Maybe it meant giving myself permission to hope again, carefully but truly. "You can tell him yes," I said to Howard the next morning. About the books, James Miller was nothing like Richard. Where Richard had been performatively charming, James was genuinely quiet. Where Richard had overwhelmed with attention, James offered space. Where Richard had demanded, James suggested. Our first conversation lasted exactly 5 minutes and covered nothing more significant than whether I preferred novels or poetry. But there was something in his eyes, respect, patience, the absence of predatory calculation that made me think healing might include more than just learning to live alone. It would be months before I trusted him enough for a proper conversation, longer still, before I could imagine a future that included loving someone again. But seeds were planted that first day, growing slowly in soil that was finally free from Virginia Blackwood's poison. James Miller was 26 when we met, tall and lanky, with gentle brown eyes and the patient manner of someone accustomed to working with skittish animals. His father owned Miller Fabric Supply, and James had been delivering to Williams Dressmaking for 2 years before I arrived. According to Betty, who made it her business to know everyone's story, he'd been engaged once to a banker's daughter who jilted him for a more prosperous suitor. "A good thing, too," Betty observed as we watched James unload bolts of wool from his delivery truck. "That Penelope Morton was all flash and no substance. James needs someone with backbone, not batting eyelashes." The first book he brought me was Jane Eyre, a choice that revealed either remarkable insight or fortunate accident. Here was a heroine who refused to be diminished by circumstances, who found strength in independence rather than submission. If James had intentionally selected it as encouragement, he was more perceptive than I'd given him credit for. "I thought you might enjoy it," he said simply when I thanked him, his hands shoved deep in his pockets with obvious nervousness. "It's about a woman who refuses to let others define her worth, so it had been intentional." The realization that someone might understand my situation without requiring explanations was both terrifying and liberating. "Have you read it?" I asked. "My sister recommended it. Sarah says all the best literature is written by women who refuse to behave properly." His smile was shy but genuine. "She might have a point. Our courtship, if it could be called, that developed over books and brief conversations during his weekly deliveries. James never pressed for more attention than I was willing to give, never questioned my skittish reactions to sudden movements or raised voices. When I flinched away from his accidentally outstretched hand one afternoon, he simply stepped back and continued our discussion of Dickens as if nothing had happened. "Time's the best medicine for most wounds," he said quietly one December evening as we stood outside the shop in the first snow of winter. "Some folks try to rush healing, but wounds rushed tend to fester." "You sound like you know something about being wounded." "Everyone knows something about being wounded. The lucky ones learn how to let themselves heal." He adjusted his scarf against the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The smart ones learn to tell the difference between doctors and people who like to pick at scabs." It was the closest we'd come to acknowledging the shadows in my past, and his gentle wisdom made something tight in my chest finally loosen. By spring of 1965, our friendship had deepened into something that felt like the beginning of love. Not the desperate, fearful need I'd mistaken for love with Richard, but something steadier and more nourishing. James brought me books and small gifts, a packet of flower seeds for the window box I'd installed in my room, a warm scarf he claimed his sister had knitted, though I suspected his own handiwork sheet music for songs he thought I might like to hum while working. The proposal, when it came, was as gentle as everything else about James. We were walking along the Ohio River on a Sunday afternoon in April, watching steamboats navigate the muddy water, while children flew kites in the Riverside Park. I'd been in Cincinnati for 8 months, and the girl who'd fled Oak Ridge in terror was gradually being replaced by someone stronger, more self-possessed. "Lenore," James said quietly, stopping beside a bench overlooking the water. "I've been thinking about the future." My stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. "What kind of future? One where I don't have to invent excuses to see you twice a week?" His smile was nervous, but determined. "One where we might build something together." "James, the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain that marriage terrified me, that the very word wife made me feel like I was drowning? "I know you're scared," he said gently. "I know someone hurt you badly before you came here. I don't need details, and I'm not asking you to forget whatever happened. I'm just asking if you think you might someday trust me enough to try again. It's not about trusting you." The honesty surprised me. It's about trusting myself. What if I'm not capable of being a good wife? What if I'm too broken? James took my hands in his, and for the first time in over a year, a man's touch didn't make me want to flee. "Eleanor Thompson," he said seriously, "you're the strongest person I know. You left everything familiar, learned a trade, built a life from nothing. If that's broken, then broken is a lot more capable than most people manage when they're whole. But what if nothing?" His voice was firm but kind. "What if we love each other enough to figure it out as we go? What if we promise to be honest about our fears instead of pretending they don't exist? What if we build something together that's different from whatever came before?" I looked at this good man who was offering me not just love, but partnership, not just marriage, but collaboration in creating something new. The girl who'd married Richard had been looking for rescue. The woman James was proposing to had learned to rescue herself. "Yes," I said quietly. "Yes, I think I'd like to try that." We were married in September 1965 at a small Methodist church in Cincinnati, with Howard and Gladys as witnesses and Betty as my matron of honor. No society wedding, no elaborate reception, no families performing for status. Just two people making promises they intended to keep witnessed by friends who genuinely cared about our happiness. James had bought a small house in the North Side neighborhood, walking distance from the shop where I continued to work. It was a modest 2-bedroom frame house with a front porch and a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden, everything I'd dreamed of during those dark months with the Blackwoods. Our wedding night was gentle, patient healing. James understood without explanation that intimacy was something I'd have to relearn, that my body carried memories of violation that would take time to replace. He was content to hold me, to let passion develop naturally, rather than demanding rights he'd legally acquired. "We have time," he whispered as I lay tense in his arms, fighting flashbacks to Richard's brutal claiming. All the time in the world, and gradually we did. Time healed what violence had damaged. Love replaced fear. Trust grew in soil that had been cleansed of Virginia's poison. By 1967, I was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear, no threats, no violence. James treated my pregnancy like the miracle it was tending me through morning sickness, rubbing my swollen feet, talking to our unborn child through my belly, with the devotion of someone who understood the preciousness of new life. Matthew James Miller was born on a snowy February morning, perfect and healthy, and loved from his first breath. As I held him in the hospital bed, counting his tiny fingers and marveling at his miniature perfection, I thought of the daughter I'd lost to Richard's violence. The grief would always be there, but it no longer defined me. 2 years later, Emily Rose joined our family, a daughter with my dark hair and James's gentle nature. Our little house filled with laughter, with the chaos of childhood, with the deep contentment that comes from building something good with someone you love. The Williams dressmaking shop prospered, and eventually James and I bought it from Howard and Gladys when they retired to Florida. We renamed it Miller Family Tailoring and expanded the business to include men's alterations and custom work. I discovered I had a talent for designing wedding dresses, perhaps, because I understood both the dreams and the fears that brides brought to their fittings. Every dress I created was made with the hope that the woman wearing it would find the kind of love I'd found with James. Not the desperate dependency I'd mistaken for love with Richard, but the equal partnership that allowed both people to grow stronger together rather than smaller apart. Years passed like pages in a favorite book full of small daily joys and occasional challenges that we faced together. Matthew grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books as much as his father did. Emily became a spirited girl who announced at age 5 that she wanted to be a seamstress like Mama and design dresses for movie stars. We were happy. Not perfectly, not without struggles, but genuinely, sustainably happy in a way I'd never imagined possible during those dark months in Oak Ridge. But happiness, I'd learned, doesn't erase the past. It just gives you strength to face it when it comes calling. In 1982, 18 years after my escape, a letter arrived that made my hands shake with old fear. The return address was Oak Ridge, Kentucky, but the handwriting belonged to my brother David, not Richard or Virginia. Dear Eleanor, I got your address from the phone book in Cincinnati after Mama mentioned you'd settled there. I'm writing with sad news. Mama's real sick with cancer and asking for you. I know there's bad blood about your first marriage, but she's dying, Eleanor. She keeps saying she needs to make things right with her daughter before she passes. If you can find it in your heart to come home, even just for a visit, it would mean everything to her. And to me. Your brother, David. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered. Mama was dying. My mother, who'd endured Daddy's violence with the same resignation I'd once shown toward Richard's abuse, was asking for me. James found me at the kitchen table, the letter spread before me like evidence of a crime I'd forgotten committing. What is it, love? He read over my shoulder, his presence warm and steady behind me. I'm sorry about your mother. I can't go back there. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. I can't see that house again, those people. You don't have to. James sat beside me, his hand covering mine. But you might regret not saying goodbye. That was the thing about marrying a good man. He helped you face hard truths instead of enabling comfortable lies. We drove to Oak Ridge the following weekend, taking the children with us. I wanted them to meet their grandmother, and selfishly, I wanted their innocence as armor against whatever ghosts still haunted my childhood home. The town had changed in the intervening years. The coal industry's decline had hit hard, leaving empty storefronts and houses in need of paint. The mansion on the hill where I'd suffered as Richard's wife stood empty, its windows boarded and its gardens overgrown with weeds. What happened to the Blackwoods? I asked David as we sat on Mama's front porch watching Matthew and Emily play in the yard where I'd once gathered eggs. Richard died about 5 years back. Liver failure, the drinking finally caught up with him. Never remarried after you left. Virginia held on longer, but she went kind of crazy toward the end, talking to herself, claiming people were trying to poison her. She died alone in that big house, and nobody found her for 3 days. Justice. I thought, though, I took no pleasure in it. Lonely, bitter deaths for people who'd chosen cruelty over kindness. Mama was skeletal from the cancer, but her eyes were still bright when she saw me walk into her bedroom. The same room where I'd once hidden from Daddy's drunken rages, where I'd dreamed of escape and happy endings. "Eleanor May," she whispered, reaching for my hand with fingers like bird bones. "You came." "Of course I came, Mama." We talked for hours over the next 3 days about my life in Cincinnati, about the grandchildren she was meeting for the first time, about regrets and forgiveness and the strange paths life takes us down. She cried when I told her about losing my first baby, raged quietly about Richard's treatment of me, marveled at photographs of my wedding to James. "I should have helped you," she said on our last evening together. "Should have found a way to get you out of that marriage before things got so bad." "You were fighting your own battles, Mama. I understand that now. Still, a mother should protect her children even when she can't protect herself." On the drive back to Cincinnati, with the children asleep in the back seat and the familiar landscape of Kentucky rolling past the windows, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace with my past. The girl who'd fled Oak Ridge in terror had returned as a woman strong enough to forgive not just others, but herself. Mama died 2 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep. I returned for the funeral, standing at her graveside beside the brother who'd written to summon me home, and feeling grateful for the chance to say goodbye. As we prepared to leave Oak Ridge for what I knew would be the last time, I made one final stop. The Blackwood mansion stood empty on its hill, its grandeur reduced to decay and abandonment. The rose garden, where I'd once tended Virginia's prized flowers, was choked with brambles, and several windows had been broken by vandals or storms. "Mama, why are we stopping here?" Emily asked from the back seat, her 9-year-old voice curious rather than afraid. "This is where your mama lived when she was younger," James explained gently, "before she came to Cincinnati and met me." "It looks scary." Matthew observed, his 11-year-old imagination filling the empty windows with ghosts. "It was scary." I agreed, getting out of the car to stand at the foot of the hill. "But scary places can't hurt you once you're strong enough to leave them behind." I thought about the girl who'd lived in that house, who'd believed she deserved the treatment she received, who'd nearly died rather than fight for her freedom. Then I looked at my children, healthy, loved, secure in their parents' devotion, and at my husband, whose patient love had healed wounds I'd thought permanent. "Time to go home," I said, getting back in the car. And for the first time in my life, I meant Cincinnati when I said home. 35 years passed like a gentle river, carrying me through seasons of contentment I'd never dared imagine during those dark days with the Blackwoods. Matthew grew up to be a teacher, following his love of books and his gift for patience. Emily became a nurse, her childhood declaration about designing dresses for movie stars evolving into a calling to heal rather than merely beautify. Both married wonderful people who understood the value of the family they were joining. Both gave James and me grandchildren who filled our later years with the particular joy that comes from watching love multiply across generations. The tailoring business thrived until we sold it in 1995, when James's arthritis made the detailed work too painful, and my eyes weren't sharp enough for the intricate beadwork that modern brides demanded. We retired comfortably, our modest investments and careful savings providing enough security for simple pleasures. Books, garden, travel to visit the children and grandchildren. James died peacefully in 2005, his hand in mine, as he had lived gently with dignity, surrounded by love. The 40 years we'd shared had been the best of my life, and I grieved his passing with the deep sorrow of someone who'd truly been blessed by partnership. But even in grief, I wasn't broken. The woman who'd learned to survive alone was still there beneath the devoted wife and mother, still capable of building a life from whatever materials remained. I stayed in Cincinnati for 3 more years, but the house felt empty without James's quiet presence. The children lived in other cities, pursuing careers and raising families of their own. Good friends passed away or moved to warmer climates. Gradually, I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own life. The decision to return to Oak Ridge came slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains. I'd received word that the town was experiencing a small renaissance, young families moving in attracted by affordable housing and the area's natural beauty. A new generation was revitalizing what the coal industry's decline had nearly killed. More importantly, Oak Ridge was where my story had begun. It seemed fitting that it should be where I chose to end it. I bought a small house on Maple Street, 3 blocks from where I'd grown up, and a comfortable distance from the hill where the Blackwood mansion had once dominated the landscape. The house was modest but charming, with a front porch perfect for quilting, and a backyard where I could grow the flowers I'd always loved. The townspeople who remembered the scared 17-year-old who'd married Richard Blackwood were curious about the confident 70-year-old who'd returned as Eleanor Miller. I made no secret of my story, the abuse, the escape, the life I'd built in Cincinnati. But I spoke of it as history, rather than shame, as lessons learned, rather than wounds still bleeding. Eleanor May Thompson, said Betty Lou Harper, encountering me at the post office during my first week back. Betty Lou had been 3 years ahead of me in school and now served as Oak Ridge's unofficial chronicler and chief gossip. I heard you were back. Heard about your husband passing too. Sorry for your loss. Thank you. James was a good man. Better than the first one, I reckon. Betty Lou's eyes held curiosity, but also respect. That was a terrible business, what happened with the Blackwoods. Folks always wondered what became of you after you disappeared that night. I made a good life for myself in Cincinnati. Raised 2 children, ran a successful business, had 40 years of happiness with a man who treated me like I was precious. Good for you, Betty Lou said, and meant it. Takes courage to start over like that. Word of my return spread quickly through Oak Ridge's small community, and I was surprised by the warmth of the welcome I received. Far from being viewed as the scandalous runaway wife who'd abandoned her husband, I was seen as a survivor who'd escaped a bad situation and built something admirable from the wreckage. Several women my age sought me out, sharing their own stories of difficult marriages and limited options. The choices available to women in 1964 had been stark and unforgiving, and many had endured what I'd fled. They treated me not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that escape was possible, that late-life happiness could follow early trauma. You did what I never had the courage to do, confided Mary Ellen Watson, whose husband had drunk away 3 family businesses before dying in a car accident in 1978. I always admired you for that, even when others were saying you should have stayed and made the best of things. It was during one of these conversations that I learned about the community center's craft programs and was invited to teach quilting to interested women. The idea appealed to me immediately. Quilting had been my solace during James's illness, my companion during the lonely years after his death. Teaching it felt like passing on more than a skill. It was sharing the meditative power of creating beauty from scraps. My first class had 6 students, women aged 30 to 70, who gathered in the community center's multi-purpose room every Wednesday evening. Some were complete beginners. Others had learned basic techniques from grandmothers and mothers, but wanted to expand their skills. Quilting is like life, I told them during our first session, displaying some of my more complex pieces. You take whatever scraps you have, bright pieces, dark pieces, torn pieces, beautiful pieces, and you figure out how to make them work together. Sometimes the most interesting quilts come from the most unlikely combinations. Sarah Michelle, a young mother struggling with her husband's recent deployment to Afghanistan, held up a piece of fabric torn from her toddler's outgrown shirt. "What about pieces that are too damaged to use?" "There are no pieces too damaged to use," I replied, taking the torn fabric and showing her how it could be incorporated into a pattern that made the damage part of the design. Sometimes the broken places become the most interesting parts of the whole. As word spread about my classes, more women joined. The group grew to include teenagers learning alongside grandmothers, single mothers, sharing techniques with empty nesters, women from different backgrounds united by the common desire to create something beautiful with their hands. We called ourselves the Oak Ridge Quilting Circle, and we became more than a craft group. We became a support network, a place where women could share struggles and triumphs, while our hands stayed busy with needle and thread. Stories emerged along with the quilts, tales of difficult marriages, challenging children, financial struggles, health scares, dreams deferred, and dreams fulfilled. I found myself becoming an unofficial counselor, offering perspective earned through decades of experience. Young women facing abusive relationships heard my story and found courage to seek help. Middle-aged women dealing with empty nest syndrome discovered that new chapters could be as fulfilling as those that came before. Older women struggling with widowhood learned that independence could be empowering rather than merely lonely. "Mrs. Miller," said Jessica Barnes, a 22-year-old whose husband's controlling behavior was escalating toward violence. "How did you know it was time to leave? How did you find the courage?" "Oh, the courage was always there," I replied, helping her align pieces for a simple 9-patch pattern. "I just had to stop believing the lies I'd been told about what I deserved. Nobody should stay in a relationship that makes them feel worthless. Love builds people up. It doesn't tear them down." These conversations, repeated in various forms as women worked through their personal challenges, gave my return to Oak Ridge a purpose I hadn't expected. I wasn't just teaching quilting. I was sharing hard-won wisdom about survival resilience and the possibility of transformation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd returned to the place of my greatest pain to become a source of healing for others. The girl who'd fled Oak Ridge in terror had returned as a woman strong enough to help others find their own paths to freedom. 5 years after my return to Oak Ridge, I was settling into a rhythm of contentment I'd never expected to find in the place of my earliest trauma. The quilting circle had grown to over 30 regular members, with a waiting list of women wanting to join. We'd moved from the community center to the basement of First Methodist Church, where we had more space and better lighting for our increasingly ambitious projects. My personal quilting had evolved, too. What had begun as therapy during James's illness had become artistic expression in my retirement. My pieces were being accepted into regional shows, and I'd even sold several to collectors who appreciated both the technical skill and the emotional depth embedded in every stitch. But it was on a crisp October morning in 2013, while tending my small garden behind the house on Maple Street, that the past reached out to claim me one final time. The young woman at my gate was perhaps 30, with auburn hair and nervous energy that reminded me painfully of myself at that age. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like armor and looked at my house as if it might bite her. "Mrs. Miller, Eleanor Miller." "Yes, dear, can I help you?" "My name is Sarah Blackwood. I was Richard Blackwood's great-niece. I wonder if I could speak with you about my family's history?" The name hit me like a physical blow, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. "I see. Well, come in then. Let's have some tea." Sarah followed me into the kitchen, her eyes taking in the warm simplicity of my home, so different from the cold grandeur of the mansion where I'd once been prisoner. I busied myself with the kettle and teacups, using the familiar ritual to steady my nerves. "I hope you don't mind me coming unannounced," Sarah said, settling awkwardly into one of my kitchen chairs. "I've been researching my family history, and your name keeps coming up in ways that don't match the stories I was told growing up." "What stories were you told?" "That my great-uncle Richard had been briefly married to a local girl who had mental problems. That she abandoned the marriage and ran away to parts unknown, leaving the family heartbroken and scandal-ridden." Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But the more I research, the more I find evidence that maybe those stories weren't entirely accurate. I poured tea for both of us, my hands steady despite the memories churning through my mind. What kind of evidence? Hospital records showing that you lost a baby under suspicious circumstances. Police reports about domestic disturbances at the Blackwood house. Witness statements from neighbors who heard screaming. Sarah opened her folder and spread documents across my kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. And this, she handed me a photograph yellowed with age. It showed me at 18 standing in the Blackwood rose garden, my face bearing bruises that had been explained away as clumsiness. But what caught my attention wasn't my own battered appearance. It was the figure in the background, partially hidden by shadow, but unmistakably watching from an upstairs window. Virginia Blackwood, her pale face twisted with the kind of hatred that could burn down worlds. "Where did you get this?" "I found it in a box of Virginia's belongings when we cleaned out the mansion before it was demolished. There were other photos too, and journals." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Terrible things, Mrs. Miller. Things about what they did to you, what they planned to do." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Journals." Virginia kept detailed records of her campaign against you. She called it the Eleanor problem and documented every humiliation, every psychological attack. She was proud of what she was doing. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed to be related to people who could treat another human being that way. I studied this young woman who bore the Blackwood name but seemed to have inherited none of their cruelty. Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" "I want to tell the truth. I'm writing a book about domestic violence in rural communities, using historical cases to illustrate how women were trapped by social expectations and legal limitations. Your story is central to the research, but I won't use it without your permission. And if I say no, then I don't use it. Your privacy and peace of mind matter more than my research." Sarah leaned forward earnestly. "But, Mrs. Miller, your story could help so many women understand that they're not alone, that escape is possible, that they can build beautiful lives after surviving hell." I looked at this earnest young woman, at the documents spread across my table, at the photograph that captured the darkest period of my life. Then I thought about the women in my quilting circle, about the conversations we'd had, about courage and survival, about the possibility of transforming pain into purpose. "All right," I said finally. "I'll tell you the whole story, but not just the ugly parts. I want you to include the healing too, the love I found with James, the life we built together. If you're going to tell my story, tell all of it." What followed were weeks of intense interviews as I recounted everything: the childhood abuse that had made me vulnerable to Richard's false courtship, the systematic cruelty of my marriage to him, Virginia's role as puppet master and primary tormentor the night of my escape when she'd nearly killed me with a kitchen knife. But I also told Sarah about Margaret Williams, whose courage had saved my life, about the community of women in Cincinnati who'd helped me heal, about James, whose patient love had taught me the difference between possession and partnership, about my children and grandchildren, about the business we'd built, about the 4 decades of happiness that had followed my 2 years of hell. "The story doesn't end with escape," I explained as we wrapped up our final interview session. "Survival is just the beginning. The real victory is in building something beautiful from whatever pieces are left." Sarah's book, Shattered Quilts: Women's Stories of Survival in Rural America, was published 2 years later by a university press. My story formed the centerpiece of a chapter titled The Architecture of Abuse, but Sarah had honored my request to include the healing alongside the hurt. The book found its audience among social workers, counselors, historians, and most importantly, women who recognized pieces of their own stories in the pages. I received letters from readers thanking me for my courage in speaking out, for proving that late-life happiness was possible, for showing that victims could become survivors and survivors could become thrivers. One letter particularly moved me. "Dear Mrs. Miller, I read your story in Sarah Blackwood's book and wanted to thank you for sharing it. I'm 26 and trapped in a marriage very similar to your first one. My husband's family treats me like you were treated by the Blackwoods, like I'm property to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Reading about your escape gave me hope that I could escape too. I've started saving money secretly like you did. I've found a women's shelter that will help me when I'm ready to leave. I keep your story with me as proof that there's life after survival. Thank you for showing me that quilts can be made from even the most damaged pieces. With gratitude, Amanda K. Letters like Amanda's reminded me why I'd agreed to share my story publicly. If my pain could prevent even one woman from enduring what I'd endured, if my survival could inspire even one person to seek their own freedom, then every moment of vulnerability had been worthwhile. The publicity from the book brought unexpected recognition to my quilting work as well. Several of my pieces were acquired by museums as examples of narrative quilting works that told stories through fabric and thread. The Smithsonian's Museum of American History purchased a quilt I'd made depicting my journey from Oak Ridge to Cincinnati to healing, calling it a masterpiece of resilience rendered in cloth. But the recognition that meant the most came from closer to home. The Oak Ridge Quilting Circle decided to create a community quilt commemorating the stories of local women who'd overcome adversity. Each member contributed a square representing her own journey from challenge to triumph. My square showed a small house surrounded by flowers with a rainbow arching overhead and the words, "Home is where healing happens," embroidered along the border. Simple compared to some of the more elaborate contributions, but true to my experience. When the quilt was completed and displayed at the Oak Ridge Community Center, the entire town came to see it. Women brought their daughters and granddaughters pointing to different squares and sharing stories of their own struggles and victories. Men came too, some looking uncomfortable, but others seeming to finally understand the private battles their wives, mothers, and sisters had fought. The mayor, a woman my own age named Patricia Cobb, spoke at the dedication ceremony. This quilt reminds us that Oak Ridge is a community of survivors of people who've taken whatever challenges life handed them and stitched them into something beautiful and strong. We're honored to display it here, where it can inspire others to keep stitching their own stories of hope. As I stood before that quilt surrounded by the women who'd become my chosen family, I felt the final circle of my life completing itself. The girl who'd fled Oak Ridge in terror had returned as a woman strong enough to help others find their courage. The victim had become a survivor. The survivor had become a thriver, and the thriver had become a guide for others still finding their way. Today, as I sit in my quilting room writing these final words, my granddaughter Emma is learning to use my old Singer sewing machine. She's 16 and fiercely independent with her grandmother's stubborn streak and her great-grandfather James's gentle patience. When I told her my story, the full story including the parts about Richard and Virginia, she was quiet for a long time before speaking. "Grandma Eleanor," she said finally, "I'm glad you were brave enough to leave. Otherwise, I wouldn't exist. It's true. Every choice creates ripples that extend far beyond our ability to see or predict. My decision to flee the Blackwood mansion didn't just save my life. It made possible the lives of my children, my grandchildren, and all the women who found courage in my story over the years." The Oak Ridge Quilting Circle continues to meet every Wednesday evening. I'm no longer the leader. At 87, I've stepped back to let younger women guide the group, but I still attend when my arthritis allows. We've welcomed 3 generations of women now, from teenagers learning their first stitches to great-grandmothers sharing techniques passed down through families. The conversations continue too. Last week, a young mother named Jennifer shared that she was leaving her abusive husband, inspired partly by reading about my own escape in Sarah's book. The group rallied around her with practical support offers of temporary housing help with job searches, childcare assistance. It's the kind of community I dreamed of during those dark nights in the Blackwood mansion, when I thought no one cared what happened to scared young wives. My health is failing now. The doctors say my heart is worn out from 8 decades of beating, including several years when it beat with constant fear. But I'm not afraid of dying. I've lived fully, loved deeply, and contributed something meaningful to the world. The girl who once stood at a bedroom window contemplating suicide chose life instead, and that choice has multiplied into countless other lives touched and changed. Last month, Emma brought me a letter that had arrived in her school's mail. Dear Mrs. Miller, you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for the quilt you donated to our domestic violence shelter 15 years ago. It hangs in our common room, and countless women have found comfort in its beauty while staying here temporarily. More importantly, many have read the note you attached, explaining your own story of survival and transformation. Your words have given hope to women who thought their situations were hopeless, courage to women who thought they were too weak to leave, and faith to women who thought happiness was impossible after trauma. One woman, Maria, kept a photo of your quilt throughout her journey from victim to survivor. She's now a counselor herself, helping other women find their strength. She calls it passing on the thread of hope. Thank you for showing us all that beautiful things can be created from the most damaged materials. With deep gratitude, Linda Martinez, Director, Safe Harbor, Women's Shelter, Phoenix, Arizona. Passing on the thread of hope. I like that phrase. It captures what I've tried to do with the second half of my life, take the dark threads of my early experiences and weave them together with the bright threads of healing and love to create something that might warm others who are cold with fear. My quilts will outlast me, carrying their messages of resilience to people I'll never meet. The women I've taught will teach others, extending the circle of creativity and mutual support into future generations. The story I shared will continue to inspire women to choose courage over compliance, freedom over familiarity, hope over despair. But perhaps my greatest legacy is simpler than all of that. Perhaps it's the proof that transformation is possible at any age, that late-blooming happiness is still happiness, that the darkest chapters of our lives don't have to define the entire story. I was Eleanor Thompson, a scared girl from a broken home. I became Eleanor Blackwood, a victim of systematic abuse and cruelty. I transformed into Eleanor Miller, a woman who learned to love and be loved. Now I'm simply Miss Ellie the Quilter, a storyteller who uses fabric and thread instead of words to share what she's learned about survival, healing, and hope. The eye that once watched me through the crack in the door is long closed. Virginia Blackwood's malice died with her as powerless in death as it ultimately proved to be in life. Richard's violence ended with his last drink, remembered now only as a cautionary tale about the cost of choosing cruelty over kindness. But love endures. James's patient devotion still warms me on cold nights. My children's laughter still echoes through every room of every house I've ever called home. The friendships I've made, the women I've helped, the stories I've shared, all of it continues threading through time like a quilt that's never quite finished. Tomorrow, if my hands are steady enough, I'll work on a new quilt. A simple pattern, something a beginner could master, because somewhere there's a woman just learning to sew, just learning to hope, just discovering that beautiful things can indeed be created from whatever scraps life provides. For her and for all the women still finding their courage, I'll keep stitching stories of survival into every seam. After all, that's what quilters do. We take pieces that seem unrelated, bright and dark, torn and whole, beautiful and damaged, and we figure out how to make them work together. We create warmth from fragments, beauty from scraps, hope from whatever materials we have at hand, just like life itself.